She came back to herself in pieces. First, the cold. That particular cold that lives inside a suit when the heating elements have been running on BSEP for too long. The kind that doesn't burn, just settles into your joints like wet concrete. Then the sound, the low rhythmic pulse of the Solus's emergency beacon. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats, pause, a metronome for the end of the world. Then finally, vision. The starfield through her visor. Absolute and indifferent, 10,000 suns that had never heard of her. Commander Mara Osi had been unconscious for 11 minutes. She knew this because her suit's internal clock told her so, and because her suit's internal clock was one of the only systems still running. Everything else, propulsion, comms, navigation, was offline or corrupted, the readings cycling through error states like a sentence that had forgotten its ending. She rotated slowly. The Solus hung maybe 200 meters out, dark on the port side, one thruster array still trailing plasma smoke. Behind her, at the end of a tether she didn't remember engaging, Lieutenant Commander Dae Jung-yoon's cryopod drifted like a seed pod, its status light blinking amber. Amber meant alive. Amber meant barely. She pulled on the tether hand over hand, moving toward him the way you move in a dream where you're running but not getting closer. Except she was getting closer, and her arms burned. And the starfield turned slowly around her, and she counted her pulls the way her father had taught her to count anything frightening. Just one more, just one more, just one more, until the pod was in her hands, and she could see his face through the frosted viewport. Slack and pale and present. She got them both to the airlock. It took 4 minutes to cycle. She spent those 4 minutes watching his vitals on her suit display, watching the amber hold. Inside, she pulled her helmet off and breathed recycled air that tasted like metal and fear, and something faintly floral. The deodorizer they used in the crew quarters. The one Dae Jung had complained about for 6 months before admitting quietly that he'd grown to find it comforting. She had never told him she felt the same. Nova. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. Status report. The ship's verbal interface answered without hesitation, its tone calibrated for professional calm, the voice of a person who has learned to deliver bad news without flinching. Welcome back, Commander. Current mission elapsed time, 243 hours. Hull integrity at 61%. Primary propulsion is offline. Emergency power is sustaining life support, internal sensors, and myself. Communications array is partially functional, short range only. The crew? A pause that lasted exactly long enough to mean something. Lieutenant Commander Yoon is in medical stasis, condition critical. The rest of the crew are unaccounted for. Mara sat with that for a moment. Unaccounted for was the word you used when you meant dead and didn't want to say it yet. What hit us? Another pause. Longer this time. Commander, I need you to come to the bridge. She found the ship in a state of violent stillness, the kind of stillness left behind after something enormous has passed through. Panels hung open. A coffee bulb had escaped its holder and drifted against the ceiling, empty. Someone had been halfway through a repair on the secondary navigation console and had simply stopped, tools still in the tray. She didn't look at the tools for long. The main display was running on its lowest power state. The holographic field, thin and slightly transparent. The kind of image you could put your hand through. What it showed made her stop moving entirely. The alien vessel was massive in a way that architectural language couldn't quite capture. Not large the way a mountain is large, with surfaces and edges you could reason about, but large the way weather is large. A phenomenon more than a structure. It hung off the Solus's port bow, motionless, radiating nothing on any spectrum she recognized. No heat signature. No electromagnetic output, just mass and the specific quality of attention that mass seemed to direct toward her damaged ship. How long has it been there, she asked. Since before I lost external sensor function, Nova said. I cannot tell you precisely. My best estimate is 12 to 14 hours, and it hasn't done anything. It destroyed us, Commander. I believe it considers that sufficient. Mara pulled up every fragment of external data Nova had saved before the sensor blackout. Partial scans, thermal shadows, gravimetric anomalies that had preceded the attack. She spread them across the display and stood in the middle of them, reading the shape of what had happened the way you read a crime scene, backward from consequence to cause. The attack had not been random. It had been surgical. 3 specific systems hit in sequence. Communications first, then navigation, then the cryo array that held the emergency evacuation pods. The sequence was deliberate. It was the sequence you used when you wanted to cripple something and strand it, not destroy it. When you wanted whatever was inside to sit with what had happened to it. They're studying us, she said. I believe so, Nova replied. Their vessel has made no further aggressive action. They appear to be waiting. For what? Nova took a moment that felt genuinely uncertain rather than programmed. I don't know. The energy readings I captured before the sensor blackout suggest they were scanning us intensively in the seconds before the attack. Something about us, or something we were doing, triggered the response. Mara thought about the mission. She thought about what the Solus had been doing when the alien vessel appeared. She thought about what humanity had learned to do 11 months ago, what had changed everything, what had sent 12 ships outward in all directions into the dark. Faster than light travel, the world's first fusion drive achieving FTL in a human vessel on October 3, 2087. It had felt like a beginning. It had felt, in every speech and broadcast and tearful celebration, like the moment humanity finally took its first step toward forever. She was beginning to think it might have been something else. Nova. Pull the mission logs, all of them. I need to understand what we looked like to whatever is out there when we arrived. The logs told a story that made the hair on her arms stand up. The Solus had arrived at the coordinates designated Prospect 7 via FTL jump, the jump itself lasting approximately 0.003 seconds from the crew's perspective. 3 milliseconds in which they had crossed 47 light-years as simply and unremarkably as stepping through a doorway. Standard arrival protocol, full sensor sweep, status check, crew health assessment. But the logs showed something else had arrived with them. It was faint, a ghost in the sensor data. An echo that Nova had flagged but not escalated. A secondary mass signature that matched the Solus's own profile almost exactly, appearing for 1.7 seconds immediately following the jump, and then disappearing as if it had never existed. Nova had logged it as sensor interference, an artifact of the FTL transition, background noise. Mara stared at it for a long time. The same entity cannot exist twice in the same moment, she said softly. It was the theoretical framework her husband had explained to her over dinner, 3 months before she left. Lev, who taught relativistic physics and made very good soup and worried about her in a specific, contained way that he tried to hide and never quite managed. He'd been excited about the FTL project, excited the way academics get excited, which is to say it manifested primarily as a lot of scribbled notes and occasional muttering. He'd said, if you move faster than light, you move backward through time, just slightly, just enough, and for 1.7 seconds you exist in a moment that you've already passed through. He'd said it was theoretically problematic. She'd kissed him and told him she'd be fine. She pressed her hand against the display viewport and looked out at the alien vessel and thought, you saw us doubled. You saw us and our echo, and you thought we were something you needed to stop. The question was whether understanding the mistake was enough to survive it. She went back to medical. Dae-jung was still in stasis, his vitals thin but holding his face through the pod window, wearing the expression of a man who was managing. He had always been managing something. She'd known him for 9 years, worked with him through 3 missions, and there was a specific way he squared his shoulders, doing something difficult that she had studied without meaning to, that she found herself counting on the way you count on a landmark. She put her palm on the pod window. I'm going to figure this out, she said. That's not a promise. That's just what's happening. Nova's voice came through the medical bay speaker, quiet, as if calibrated to match the intimacy of the space. Commander, there is something you should know. Tell me. In the sensor data, the secondary mass signature. Another pause, this one carrying a different weight. It was not sensor interference. Mara turned from the pod. What was it? It was the Solus, a version of the Solus that arrived 1.7 seconds before we did. The FTL jump folded us back across our own timeline, briefly by fractions, long enough for an external observer to see 2 of us occupying the same space. We already knew that. Yes. But Commander, the secondary signature contained biological readings. Nova's voice, if a voice could be said to do this, seemed to choose its words with care. There was a life sign on the secondary vessel that does not match any current member of our crew. The silence stretched out. Where? Mara asked. Section 4. Cargo hold. The cargo hold was dark and smelled of machine oil and the specific staleness of spaces that rarely see human traffic. Mara moved through it with a hand torch, the beam sweeping across equipment crates and storage manifolds, and the long shapes of survey drones in their cradles. She found what she was looking for in the back corner, behind a row of fuel cell containers. It was her, or had been. The other Mara was lying against the bulkhead, in a position that spoke of someone who had found a wall, and decided that wall was sufficient. Her suit was compromised at the shoulder, the patch job ragged, the kind of work you do under pressure when you're already running out of time. She looked. The word that came to mind was older, but that wasn't quite right. It was more that she looked finished. The way a piece of writing looks when someone has said what they were going to say and put down the pen. Her eyes were closed. Her vitals on the suit readout were absent. Mara crouched beside her, beside herself. She noted distantly that she felt no vertigo about this, which surprised her. Maybe this was the thing the philosophers got wrong about encountering yourself. They assumed it would be destabilizing. What it actually felt like was grief. Clear, heavy, familiar grief. In the other Mara's hand, held loosely, was a tablet. Mara took it. The screen still had power, faintly. There were 47 minutes of log entries. She watched them in the cargo hold, sitting on the floor, while the ship creaked around her, and Nova's emergency beacon pulsed its patient rhythm. In the entries, the other Mara, the one who had arrived 1.7 seconds earlier, who had spent those seconds living a version of this that Mara had been spared, explained everything she'd learned. The alien vessel was called, in the closest phonetic approximation human systems could manage, the Wraith. They were not, she said, hostile in any framework that included judgment or malice. They were conservationists. They patrolled the territories near the galactic core enforcing a single law. The law of singular presence, the principle that no consciousness should exist doubled in any moment, because doubled consciousness created cascading paradox, and cascading paradox, at sufficient scale, unmade things. The FTL drive had shown them two solaces. That was the violation. The other Mara had tried to communicate this. She had figured it out. Mara recognized the process of figuring, the specific texture of her own thinking working through a problem, and she had managed to transmit something toward the Wraith vessel, some pattern of signals that she had believed might be interpretable as the word mistake. As the concept wait, it had bought 17 minutes. The attack had come anyway, the last entry was short. The other Mara looked directly at the camera, and there was something in her eyes that Mara recognized from mirrors. The expression of a person who has decided to stop performing certainty and just tell the truth. I don't know if this reaches you, she said. I don't know if the physics even works that way, whether you can receive something from a version of yourself that's already gone. Maybe this is just me talking to the inside of a box, a breath. But if it does, if you're watching this, the signal pattern in the tablet's secondary memory, and they responded to it, Mara. Whatever it was, however badly I got it wrong, they responded. They slowed down, they listened. She paused. The problem wasn't that we were wrong. The problem was that I ran out of time before I could find the right shape for the right. The recording ended. Mara sat with it. She sat with it, the way her father had taught her to sit with hard things, which was the same way he'd taught her to count frightening things. Not by resolving them, but by letting them be fully present, until they settled into something you could carry. Then she stood up. She took the tablet, she walked back to the bridge. Nova, I need you to help me build a signal. What followed was 3 hours of work that Mara would later describe. In the mission report she was not yet certain she would survive to file, as the most frightening and the most purely focused thing she had done in her life. She and Nova pulled apart the signal pattern from the tablet, analyzed its structure, mapped it against everything they had on xenolinguistics and communication theory, and the specific energy frequencies the Wraith vessel had emitted in the moments before each response. They found the architecture of it, the underlying logic. It was not language exactly, but it was adjacent to language. The way music is adjacent to speech, conveying relationship and intent through proportion rather than symbol. The other Mara had gotten the shape nearly right. She had communicated something like, our doubling was accidental, we did not intend the paradox. But she hadn't had time for the second part, the part that might have mattered more. We understand the law. We will not break it again. The thing about that second statement was that it required something specific to make the Wraith believe it. Not just the signal pattern, not just the intent, but evidence. Proof that the paradox had resolved. Proof that the doubled consciousness was no longer doubled. Mara understood what that meant. She went back to Section 4. She stayed there for a few minutes with her hand on the cold shoulder of the woman who had lived this first and done the work of understanding it and left her a way through. Then she did what you do with a fallen astronaut, which is the same as what you do with any fallen person. You take note of them, and you remember them, and you carry them with you, even when you can't carry them with you. She returned to the bridge and sent the signal. It took 9 minutes. She stood at the viewport and watched the Vraith vessel and waited. And she thought about Lev and his soup and his worried hands and the way he'd said she'd be fine even though he hadn't believed it. Because sometimes what love requires of you is the performance of a faith you don't feel. She thought about Dae-jung in his pod, managing. She thought about the 11 other ships out there in the dark, all of them carrying the same FTL drive, all of them potentially visible as double signatures to whatever else lived in the spaces between stars. The Vraith vessel shifted, just slightly, a degree of rotation, a reorientation of its mass. She had the sensor data from before the blackout, and she could see it in the readings that Nova was carefully reconstructing. The change in posture, the way something very large can communicate attention simply by the direction it turns. The attack did not come. Instead, something else came. A signal, structured and deliberate. A pattern she couldn't parse but whose emotional logic she felt rather than understood. The way you feel the difference between a silence that means waiting and a silence that means finished. It lasted 18 seconds, then the Vraith vessel began slowly, unmistakably to move away. Nova translated what it could, which was not much but which was something. The closest interpretation I can render, Nova said, is an acknowledgement, something like, the paradox is resolved, something like, we see only one. Mara exhaled. It was not, she thought, a treaty. It was not a first contact in any of the forms they had trained for or imagined. It was something more preliminary than that. A single exchange in a language that didn't exist yet between a species that had never met, establishing only the most basic fact, that they could find the shape of a thing neither of them had words for. We are here, we are one, we understand that matters. She began the emergency distress signal on the short-range comms, the one that would take weeks to reach anyone who could respond. And she went back to medical, and she sat beside Dae-jung's pod and rested her forehead against the cool polymer and felt, for the first time in 11 minutes or 243 hours or 39 years, depending on how you counted, the specific quality of being exactly where she was. Amber still, barely still, but held. Out in the dark, the Vraith vessel dwindled to a point among points, and the stars were absolute, and the Solus's beacon kept its patient count. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats, pause. And Mara Osi, who was one person where a moment had briefly tried to make her 2, breathed recycled air that smelled of metal and deodorizer, and began to figure out how long the power would last, and what she had to work with, and what came next. She was very good at figuring out what came next.